Ethiopia's prosperity has been hampered by its internal conflict after conflict. Over the last 2-3 years alone, thousands of people died, millions are displaced because of the bloody conflict that the country had passed through. Such bloody conflict, such devastating war has been halted after the Pretoria Peace Agreement, the agreement between TPLF and the federal government of Ethiopia in Pretoria, South Africa. That is wonderful ended. However, there is one key point that some politicians, law experts, historians, and other prominent people of the country advocate. That is transitional justice. These people come to say, like, even the recent conflict between TPLF and the federal government of Ethiopia is not current one, it's not a new one. Rather, it has to do much with history. Therefore, the country has to reconcile with herself for permanent and sustainable peace. Dear viewers, today's discussion point is transitional justice, and for this I'm joined by Associate Professor of Law Balaina Admasu. Please do stay with us. Associate Professor Balaina Admasu, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, I have been listening about transitional justice since the 2018 political reform begins in Ethiopia, and some people are really optimistic about transitional justice. So what is transitional justice? What kind of justice is it? Let's begin with this.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, transitional justice, as you have said, is advocated by different scholars and experts as a solution for conflict and conflict-related issues. Transitional justice does have a very long history and experience in the world. So, it has contributed a lot to solve the conflicts. Having said this, transitional justice is just a sort of justice which is usually practiced during transitions from one regime to regime or after a period of conflict, which is promoting, justice, compensation, and reconciliation among the parties who were involved in conflict during different times. So, this is very, very essential, so it is very difficult. Actually, transition justice takes long time, demands labor and money. Because of this, transitional justice is usually advocated by scholars, experts, in order to solve conflicts. On the other hand, taking into consideration the difficulty of the transitional justice implementation, it might not also possible to ignore, the conflicts or the systematic abuse of human rights as they are, because if they are not able to be solved by using the transitional justice in manner, they may become source of social unrest, as well as will contribute towards the renewed violences. So just to solve the problems from their root cause, using transitional justice is very, very, very important, because it helps us to compensate wrongs as well as putting this right after conflict. Based on this, we can give scientific definition for transitional justice. So many scholars attempted to define transitional justice in a very different way. What I'm going to present here is just a very simple one. So transitional justice is a process of acknowledging, prosecuting, compensating for, and forgiving the past crime and wrongdoings after conflict during rebuilding of well-functioning state as well as status. In other words, whenever you want to reconstruct the state as well as the society which has been distracted by conflict, we should try to acknowledge, prosecute, compensate for, and forgiving the past crimes or the crimes which are committed in the conflict. Otherwise, it would disturb the coming generation, as well as it would not be possible to build the rule of law, democracy, and sustainable peace in a country or in a society. Because of this, transnational justice is usually defined as a means or as a solution for, acknowledging the victim suffering, as well as, compensating their harms by making or creating a very smooth and peaceful relationship between victims and offenders. This is the concept of, the transitional justice in a whole.
Thank you very much for giving us such scientific explanation of transitional justice. You have touched the point one way or other, but let me ask you the goal of transitional justice, why it is relevant to implement transitional justice in a country, in a society.
Yeah, as I have attempted to explain in the definition part, transitional justice does have its own goals and strategies. Whenever it is implemented, those who are carrying transitional justice intended or aimed to achieve at least the following, goals. The first one is, establishing the truth about what happened and why. During conflict, there would be different, crimes, different actions which have been committed by the perpetrators. So what happened is a very serious issue before we proceed to, solve the problem. So, establishing the truth, what happened and why it has happened must be well refined or investigated. So one of the goals is just, finding the truth which is committed during conflict. The second, goal is acknowledging the victim suffering. Whenever there is a conflict, there would be victims or individuals who are victimized during victims. There would be victims who are suffering from gross human rights violations and other kinds of crimes. So, in one or other way, addressing the victim's harms, needs, or suffering is quite important. So, the very purpose of the transitional justice must be, identifying harms, needs of victims and acknowledging their sufferings or harms in order to address or in order to repair it later. The third one should be, making the offenders accountable or liable to their wrongdoings. Which means offenders or those who are involved in the commission of the crimes during conflict must be responsible and must, acknowledge the result of their actions or their wrongdoing. The third must be, just compensating the wrongdoing or the sufferings. Who should compensate might be discussed later, but compensating the victims who are suffering from the harm must be well addressed as a goal or must be taken as an ultimate end. The other important point is just prevent the future abuses. Whenever we carry out transitional justice, the ultimate end, one of the ultimate end or goal must be just to prevent the future abuses. We should reduce the likelihood of committing the same crimes or further crimes. The other important one is, social healing. Healing justice is very important. Whenever we carry out transitional justice, the ultimate end or goal must be, promoting social healing justice. The society should understand to repair here the wound which is resulted from the conflict through reconciliation and compensation. So these ultimate end or goal must be taken into consideration whenever we carry out transitional justice. Transitional justice. To do this, there would be different kinds of strategies, as you have attempted to explain before. Reconciliation tools are very important. To do so, there would be different kinds of strategies or methods or techniques that should be employed. The first one, which is usually common in our country and other countries, is criminal prosecution. Criminal prosecution is usually carried out as a strategy or as a technique, and we'll deal with it later in a very specific way. The second one is, truth and reconciliation. In addition to criminal prosecution, there should be truth and reconciliation. Truth finding and making reconciliation is very important technique or method in order to achieve the goal mentioned above. And the third one is just compensation and reparation. Those who have been victimized during conflict must be compensated and repaired in order to heal their harms inflicted against them during the inflict. The last but not the least is innovating the very abusive public officials from their public offices. In other words, we have to administratively exclude those who were involved in the commission of the crime when we carry out transitional justice system. Unless and otherwise we are able to remove or administratively exclude these persons or individuals, it might be very difficult to carry out transitional justice system in a very smooth manner. So these strategies and goals shall be taken into consideration whenever we think of the transitional justice.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating idea, isn't it? Let's bring the science into the ground.
Yeah.
We all know the context of Ethiopian politics, where everybody is feeling victimized and pointing finger at another. So my question here is, can transitional justice bring justice for Ethiopians? Or can transitional justice heal the sick politics of Ethiopia and can create a harmonized Ethiopia?
Good. Yes and no would be the answer for this question.
All right,
because,
let me hear your argument.
Transitional justice has been experimented or tested in other countries like Rwanda, South Africa, Cambodia, Sierra Leone, and other, African and Latin American countries.
Exactly. Tell us the international experience in this regard.
This has been, tested and brought result or the benefit from the transitional justice system. For example, you take our neighboring country, Rwanda. There was a very serious conflict between the two ethnic groups, as you know, yeah?
Hutu and Tutsi.
Yeah, Tutsi and Hutu. So after the conflict, the issues were settled in two ways. The first one is, criminal prosecutions, which is a part or component of the transitional justice system. Those who have been directly involved in, the crime have been, tried by the international tribunal established for this purpose, and they gained it or benefit from it. The remaining, issues or crimes have been settled through negotiation or dialogue or through truth and conciliations. In other words, truth and conciliation has been taking places in order to create a very smooth and reconciled relationship between the two ethnics. And some literature tell us that, they have benefited from it, and they are now developing their own peace and democracies in their own territory by, taking the benefit of transitional justice into practices or into consideration. And the same is true in the case of South Africa. South Africa, Truth and Reconciliation Commission has been established and attempted to solve the problem after the conflict between the white and the black, as you know, yeah?
Yeah.
So they have benefited from it a lot, so long as it's possible to properly implement transitional justice system it might also be very useful for Ethiopian cases. Yeah. So what is required just to benefit from this transnational justice in the case of Ethiopia is very important point for me, because in order to benefit from the transnational justice system, Ethiopians are required to develop a sort of democratic culture. In other words, we should listen to each other, we should tolerate to each other, we should ready in order to settle the problem through our alternative alternative customary solutions. We do have a number of customary dispute resolution mechanisms in Ethiopia. So long as Ethiopia is a bottle of so many ethnic groups, we do have a number of different kinds of alternative dispute mechanisms. If we are able to ready to employ this kinds of alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, and we are ready to use them, I'm quite sure that Ethiopia will benefit from the transnational justice system. And it is also quite important to identify the parties at stake. Yes, using or having the alternative dispute resolution mechanism by itself is not able to be an end in order to utilize the transnational justice system. The very important point is, who are going to negotiate to each other? Who are going to reconcile to each other? What are going to be done in order to find out the truth which has been carried out between the victims and the offenders? Unless and otherwise we are able to identify the parties as a stake, it might be very difficult to benefit from the transnational justice system. So for me, the second point that should be taken into consideration should be just identifying the parties at stake and their harms and needs properly. The other point that should be taken into consideration in order to benefit from the transnational justice system is, just establishing the very important platform or institutions. As I have said before, South Africa has established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and has benefited from the transnational justice system which is taken place by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So what kind of institution or platform is important or appropriate for Ethiopia is also another important point that should be addressed in order to benefit from the transnational justice system. As you know, within the last 3 years, Peace and Reconciliation Commission was established in Ethiopia at the federal level, yes? Sure. Yeah. So its period of time has been elapsed before, it starts its work, yeah? Yes. So such kind of, platform is very important. You might use Human Rights Commission, or you might use, another kind of platform or institution which are available in Ethiopia, but it is quite important to study it very critically in order to benefit from the transnational justice systems. There are a lot of, other, requirements or points that should be taken into consideration before we decide, Ethiopia can benefit from the transnational system or transnational justice. Transnational justice may, create a reconciled Ethiopia. So just to decide this point, these and other points shall be taken into consideration.
Good. Nowadays, it's very common to hear about transitional justice. Did Ethiopia implement transitional justice in the past, in history?
Good. Similar response or answer might be given for this question too, because there were attempts made in order to reconcile or in order to carry out transitional justice system. Yeah, because so many regimes have been changed in Ethiopia, and during that there were transitions. For example, following the downfall of Haile Selassie regime, the Derg regime attempted to make a sort of transitions, and at that time Derg has attempted to take measure against the officials during the Haile Selassie regime, and it might be very difficult to say that there was transitional justice at that time, because those who were involved or those who were suspected of committing crimes were collected and simply killed, in 1975, before the Truth Commission, finished its investigation. So it might be very difficult to say that there was transitional justice, but there was a transition at that time, The second transition was, just transitional from Derg regime to EPRDF, 1991. So at that time again there was transitions, and following that transitions the PRDF attempted to make a sort of transitional justice system, and it employed one of the components of the transitional justice system, so-called criminal prosecutions, or instituted criminal charges against the Derg officials who were suspected of committing crimes during the Derg regime, including Mengistu, Colonel Mengistu Amhara. A number of the Derg officials were tried because of, they were suspected of committing crimes during the Derg regime. But this was not as such taken like a transitional justice system due to different pitfalls. Whenever we analyze it from the perspective of transitional justice transitional justice, it have a number of pitfalls or weaknesses, just not to say it was real, transitional justice. One of these was, it was not as such concerned on the truth and reconciliation. It was simply, promoting, or it was simply, concerned only on the criminal justice system, criminal prosecutions, or instituting criminal charges against the Derg officials was the sole, component or technique which was employed in order to settle the issue. Another important point which I want to raise, not to say this, or not to say, transitional justice is, there was no as such the involvement of the victims themselves, unless and otherwise they give information or they present as a witness in the court. They couldn't have a chance to face up with the offenders in order to deal with about their harms, about their wrongdoing, suffering from their actions. Witnesses were called upon by the courts, and the victims simply appear and tell what happened and what crime was committed against their families or against them. So this situation was not as such, an element of the transitional justice. And another important point which I wanted to raise in connection with this, all the Derg officials who were suspected of committing crime were not again brought to courts even. Only few, Derg officials were, tried before court. So because of this and other grounds, it might be very difficult to say that it was real transitional justice. Again, another transition is the transition which was made from, the transition which was made in 2018, the government reformation. At that time again, there was a transitions, and an attempt has been made in order to carry out transitional justice. But all these three transitions attempted to carry out transition justice, but all attempts were not as such complete and clear or full-fledged from the to say transitional justice.
As you explained it in the opening, transitional justice can give an end to the past injuries, to the past injustice, so that the present and the future generation of the country can live in peace, in harmony. So why we're still fighting each other if we implemented transitional justice in the past, during EPRDF government, during Derg regime?
The transitional justice which have been attempted in our history couldn't repair or couldn't heal the harms or the injuries committed against the people. Because, the Derg, both Derg and APRDF, attempted to prosecute the officials only. There was no, dialogue among the victims and the offenders, among the perpetrators and the victims. And even there was no, dialogue among the parties at the stake. For example, if you ask for who are victims during the regime of Haile Selassie, who were the wrongdoers at that time, who were victims during the Derg regime, and who were also the wrongdoers, no clear investigation has been made in order to identify the harms and the needs of the people. They simply, prosecute the officials. They simply try the officials and penalize. The very purpose of the prosecution, as you know, is just to penalize or punish the criminals or the perpetrators only. Never give due emphasis, never give due concern and attention to the reconciliation and truth. And instead of giving attention to truth and reconciliation, they simply focus on the guilt of the perpetrators. They simply, imprison the officials. Then the people have no chance or opportunity to deal with about the harms, needs, and how they are able to repair their harms. Because of this, the conflict still continued, and still there is no real transitional justice in Ethiopia. That is why the conflict is still, available in our country. Even at this time, within these 3 years or 5 years, there is no real transitional justice unless otherwise there is no, unless otherwise there is war. Yeah, there might war, there might attempts to carry out or establish the truth. The peace and reconciliation commission, but there is no real discussion, real dialogue, real truth and reconciliation processes among the victims and the wrongdoers. That is why the conflict still continues, exists.
So what we need to do to end the chapter of mistrust, hatred, civil war between and among peoples of Ethiopia. In this regard, what today's government learn from the past?
Good. Yeah. As I attempted to explain before, there are a lot of pitfalls or weaknesses of the transitional justice attempted to carry out in the past history. One of the problem is absence of dialogue or discussion among the victims and the wrongdoers. Yeah, and this government or the current government can learn, this from the past histories. If possible, what should be done is, just creating platforms or establishing the very genuine and reliable platform in order to carry out, dialogues, in order to carry out discussions, in order to carry out, in order to talk of, the past, injury. This is the first that the government should learn, should understand, should take into consideration. The second one is, identifying harms and the needs of the victims must be taken places. Unless and otherwise you are able to identify the victims and the wrongdoers, you are not able to carry out any kind of transitional justice. What should be done is, identifying harms and needs of the victims and the offenders. In order to identify harms and needs of the offenders and the victims and wrongdoers should be identified. For example, who are wrongdoers during EPRDF?
Yeah.
What are their harms and needs of the victims? must be well identified. You know, this was not done during, you know, EPRDF and Derg regime too. So this government should learn this from the past history of our transitional justice, attempts of the transitional justice. The other important point which I want to say is, you know, assigning very, very, very appropriate and acceptable, you know, individuals in order to carry out the transitional justice. There might be individuals who have been recruited by the government officials without the consent of the victims and wrongdoers, or without the consent of the pupil. In other words, pupils should have say about the persons who are going to be assigned as elders or as facilitators. If, for example, you know, in 2019, you know, the Peace and Reconciliation Commission was established, and there were about there was about 41 members, yeah, of the commissions. Who selected them? Who are they? Do the people say about their acceptance, about their integrity, about their, you know, responsibility? So, you know, the people should be given, you know, an opportunity to say about the individuals who are going to be recruited, appointed as a member of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee or Commission. And the other important point which I want to say is, you know, those who are going to be reconciled should be involved in the selections of the elders too, or the negotiators too, or members of the commission too. Not let alone the people, even the victims and wrongdoers must be given an opportunity to say something about who are going to be judged, because about who are going to consulators. Unless and otherwise we believe in the integrity of the consulators, those who are going to put in negotiation or in dialogue may not accept those people. So these and other requirements should be taken very, very seriously.
Do you think there is a good appetite, a good mood for implementing transitional justice in current Ethiopian politics?
Good. Yeah. Actually, there are justifying circumstances in order to carry out transitional justice, as I have attempted to explain you before. Because, you know, there was civil war, there were conflict, and there were also so many disputes among the peoples and individuals even. These justify the existence of what? The existence of, or the importance of the transitional justice. And secondly, as you know, there is no such good peace and democracy at this time, and even the rule of law as well as human rights have become questionable in our country at this time, particularly after conflict. These circumstances justify, you know, transitional justice. But, you know, the appetite is really difficult to say that there is or there is no appetite, because, you know, we are not still sure about the people who need to negotiate or who need, you know, to involve in the truth and reconciliations. As I have said before, who are going to be, who are the parties at stake in order to carry out? Because, you know, the conflict is usually carried out by the elites and the political parties or officials, So, are the people actually interested to carry out transitional justice to each other? Is a very, very, you know, difficult question to answer. For me, having transitional justice is very, very important, and I'm really interested to carry out or to promote such kind of transitional justice in order to bring peace or sustainable peace, democracy, and smooth and amicable relationship among the Ethiopians. Because there are the existing circumstances justify transitional justice.
All right.
So it's quite important.
Quite important.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the most debatable issue with regards to implementing transitional justice in Ethiopia is how many years should transitional justice covers, or to put it in a clear way,
Yeah.
when should the implementation of transitional justice starts in history. Some people say, for example, that transitional justice should cover the injuries and the atrocities that were made over the past 3 years. Some others say transitional justice should cover all the injustice perpetrated over the past 30 years. And some others want it to be for 100 years. So in your opinion, when should the implementation of transitional justice begin in Ethiopia?
Yeah, very interesting question, because, you know, time is by itself an essential element of transitional justice. As I have attempted to explain the goal of transitional justice, it is just to find out the factors or establishing truth, yes? So in order to establish truth, what happened and why, you know, we have to determine the time. We have to determine the period of the conflicts. In our country, you know, conflicts are historians, yes? Because in our history, there are a number of conflicts done. There are a number of systematic, you know, violation of human rights, as well as there were also operations, political operations, even during Haile Selassie, during the Derg regime, and during the EPRDF. So, you know, taking transitional justice during the regime of Haile Selassie, during the regime of Derg and EPRDF, even currently, is quite important. But the very big problem is, you know, how are we going to discover the factors and causes of the conflict or the injury done during Haile Selassie? Because we have passed about 40 years after, you know, downfall of Haile Selassie. If we decide, or if we say that transitional justice should be taken places, you know, in order to reconcile the society or in order to build the society, you know, it might be very difficult to obtain information and evidences about the factors and causes done during the regime of Haile Selassie. Even it would be very difficult to find out cases, I mean, information and evidences, you know, about the atrocities, about the crimes, about the wrongdoings done during the Derg regime. So for me, so long as our interest is keeping or ensuring sustainable peace and democracy, what's better is, you know, taking into consideration the recent conflicts. Just 5 years onwards. Because if we are able to carry out transition or truth and reconciliations among the victims and the wrongdoers, we are able to get the victims and the wrongdoers. Similarly, if we are able to identify the victims or wrongdoers, we are able to get them. Otherwise, you know, it might be very difficult to obtain victims and wrongdoer who were involved in the commission of the crime committed during Derg as well as, you know, Haile Selassie. Even it might be to obtain information and evidences about the crimes done during EPRDF, unless and otherwise we are able to, you know, find out the cases instituted in the court. So, you know, because of this, I strongly believe that, you know, the recent conflicts should be taken into consideration in order to carry out truth and reconciliations. Of course, it might be possible to argue that, you know, though we are not able to get information, evidence, victims as well as wrongdoing who were in Derg and Haile Selassie regime, it's possible to say, you know, reconciliation and apology in a very blanket way. Yeah.
In a very blanket way.
Yeah. So if we say that, it's possible to carry out. Otherwise, for me, truth and reconciliation is not able to be taken without information, without evidence, and in absence of victims and wrongdoers. So what's better is just taking into consideration the recent conflicts.
That is personal opinion indeed.
Yeah.
Associate Professor Belaina Hadmasu, thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your in-depth knowledge and golden perspective regarding the topic of our discussion, the quest for transitional justice in Ethiopia. Really appreciate your time.
I also thank you for this opportunity, and I hope that we will do a lot in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dear viewers, that's all I have for you for today. Many thanks for watching, and please do stay with the rest of our programs.